Hi everyone and welcome back or welcome to Stitches Past 5. My name is Vera and today I thought I would share some of the things that you really need when you want to start knitting or when you are a knitter. Maybe the things that are nice to have and some of the things that you don't need. So I made a similar video on crochet, but knitting is quite different or a little bit different in my opinion, so I just thought that I would share my knitting opinions. I've been knitting for like a long time, kind of on and off, but more on than off in the last like 5-6 years. But I started to knit when I was like 7 or 8 years old, I believe. And yeah, I've just kind of always had it like as a little hobby, sometimes as a bigger hobby, depending on how much time I've had throughout the years. But I have always kind of only done knitting with the basics. Like I've only kind of recently started to buy a little bit more stuff. Now we do live in a really small apartment, so I don't have the capacity to just kind of buy everything and store it somewhere because I don't have the storage space, and nor do I think I really need that much stuff because I do just fine. Like I still make my knitting and I still make my pieces. I basically am able to make everything I have been able to make, and if I run into a situation where I really need something, only then will I buy it. I think that's been a really good habit that I've kind of always had, just because yeah, that way you A, kind of save a lot of money, and B, you don't accumulate that many things. Yeah, so today I thought I would share three ranks, if you will, with you. The first one is items that you absolutely need when you want to start knitting or when you are a knitter. These are your basics. Without these, you can't knit. Then I have a few lists, a few items on the list of things that are nice to have, but you could probably also do without them. But with these, it's like, it'll be tricky doing it without them. And then I have a long list of things that, in my opinion, you don't really need. In my opinion, you can substitute these items and save a bunch of money, especially if you're just starting out, or if you, like me, are living in a small space, or you're just not really sure, or you just don't want to spend hundreds of euros, dollars on things that you might not use that much. Now, a little disclaimer before I share these lists. Of course, this is from my experience. These are from all the items that I've knit over time. If you have a different experience, if I say something that I don't think you need and you're like, no, I absolutely need that, please leave it in the comments below. I would love to hear like different reasoning and different like maybe projects that you've needed certain things for. But without further ado, let's get started. Okay, I think something else I have to say is I do own a lot of these, even if I'm gonna tell you that you probably don't need it. Some of the things on my don't need list are like things that I have but don't use and therefore I don't think you need it, or I don't have and therefore I think you don't need it because, yeah, I've never been in a situation where you need them. Okay, so I have my list here. The first category is your must-have. So without these, it's not going to be possible really to knit. And the first one is knitting needles. So the world of knitting needles can be an intimidating one, especially if you're just starting out and maybe you're going to the yarn shop for the very first time, or to the craft shop to buy your knitting needles, because there are a lot of different ones. Okay, so I have a few to show you here. Essentially there are needles that allow you to knit in the round, which look like this. They have like a cable attached, and then you have your needles, and then they come in different lengths, and yeah, depending on what you knit, you will need different lengths of these. There is ways to like kind of compensate different length cables, but that's pretty difficult. So I'd say if you're gonna make a sweater or something, read the pattern and just get whatever it says in the pattern. It'll tell you to get 60 centimeters, 40 centimeters, 80, 100, whatever it calls for. Then you usually have the size of your needle like written in these ones. It's like kind of printed in the inside here. Not all of them have it, but it's always good to know which needle size you need. And then if you're starting, I would really recommend you just buy the needle size that you want to knit with. And if you don't have a specific project you want to start on, say you just want to practice, I recommend you get a medium-sized needle, nothing too small because that's like very finicky and not that easy to learn on. So if you're really a starter, if you're a beginner and you just want to get your pearls and your knits, get a thicker needle. So I'd say anything above like a 4mm needle, you'll be just fine. Then there are these long ones, which I personally really do not like. I own these because I got most of my knitting stuff from my grandmother, and they look like this and they're so long. And the reason I don't like them is because when you're knitting and you have like a lot of stitches here, it becomes very, it's like you like hit people on the side, and it's just very like heavy to get your stitches, and I just don't particularly enjoy the haptic experience that you get with these. So I own them, I don't use them. I'll probably either throw them out or keep owning them, but I would recommend you don't get these needles. Then there are sock needles or double pointed needles, which look like this. These are actually made from wood. They're typically a little bit thinner because they're used for smaller items like socks, like gloves. Yeah, if you have these, go for it. If you don't need them, I wouldn't go out and buy them right away. I would just say buy the needles that you need for your project. If you're starting on a sock, yeah, then you'll need these. But unless you're doing that, I would recommend that you get the ones with the cable because those are very versatile. The last one I want to show you is this one, which I've also inherited from my dear grandmother, which is this stopper needle. I would say that you do not need these right at the beginning, definitely not. They're just some project required you put stitches on rest, and yeah, you can do that with this. That's the only time I've ever really used it, but you don't really need these. So I would recommend you get something like this to start off with. Now, if you are willing to invest like a little bit more money, there are these beautiful sets where you can actually like screw off the ends and exchange your needle thickness with the cable length that you need. And I think they start at around 50-60 euros, and to the upper end there's little limits, put it that way. And yeah, I think if you are willing to invest a little bit more money, I think that's a really good thing to have, because it's just one case usually that has everything you need for most projects. I don't own that because I, like I said, have most of my stuff from my grandma and she has like everything, so I just took it from her. I didn't want to spend more money on things that are already there. But yeah, so there are metal needles, there are wooden needles, and then sometimes there are plastic needles, and I'd say it's really just personal preference. Sometimes different needles or different materials correspond differently with different types of yarn. I think that's also something that you'll get used to over time, and you'll figure out your own preference. I will also say that just because someone tells you that something does or doesn't work doesn't mean that's the same for you, so just, you know, it's a little bit of trial and error, but something that you definitely need at the beginning of your knitting, or really if you're in the middle of your knitting as well, are knitting needles. The next thing on my list is an obvious one, and that is yarn. So you're gonna need yarn in the life of your knitting career or in your knitting life. What yarn that is, I think especially at the beginning, is really up to you. I don't think it's necessary to spend a lot of money on yarn right when you're just learning how to do your stitches. I think, yeah, there's so many yarn companies and so many cool, beautiful, nice yarn shops, distributors, sellers, but that's all something for you to figure out over time. I think if you're starting off with a thick acrylic yarn that you would never want to wear or you'd never want to make anything out of, even if it's just for practicing, that's perfect, that's all you need. I think that's all I'll say on yarn. If you are choosing to make a pattern, I would go in the order of get the pattern first, check the difficulty level on the pattern, but get the pattern first and then get the corresponding yarn and the corresponding needle size. I think if you have a needle size and then you want to see what you can make without that needle size, if you only have one or two, you can be quite limited. So I'd say a good starting point is the pattern. Another thing that is pretty important when you're knitting is scissors. I have 2 sets of these. These are specific like craft scissors, literally any scissors, even like a knife to trim your or to cut your yarn will do just fine. I have these, I like them, they're small, they fit most places. I've seen people use nail clippers, especially if they're traveling hand luggage. Scissors you will need, otherwise you're tearing your yarn and that's not really ideal, especially over time. And then the last thing that's on my must-have list is needles. So there will come a time in your project where you will need to sew in the loose ends, and that's a really big pain. I guess it is doable with a knitting needle, but that's really difficult to do. So the last thing that's on my must-have list are needles. I have a few different ones, so I'm going to show you. This is a metal needle and this is a plastic needle. There we go. They come in all different types of sizes and widths and lengths and everything. I would say you can never go wrong with your basic metal needle. Yeah, just if you're using really big yarn, you might need like a bigger needle, like a bigger end to get it through. But honestly, I use this needle for like 90% of my projects, unless I'm working like on a plushie or something. But that's mostly crocheting that I use this. But for knitting, like this has been more than fine. Okay. So in my opinion, those are the 4 things: knitting needles, yarn, scissors, and a needle that, or sewing needle I should say, that's really all you need to knit. Like everything else will kind of come over time, and therefore it's on my good to have or don't really need list. So moving on to the good to haves. Again, these are items that will make your life easier knitting, but if you don't want to spend a lot of money or if you want to stay minimalistic, then you don't really need these items in my opinion. You can substitute them for others, and I will share those as well. But yeah, even myself, I've probably knit for 10 years without a lot of these and I was doing just fine as well. Now, mind you, as you kind of progress in your knitting, as you progress in the intricacy of the projects you make, you might be acquiring more and more of these with time. But I think that's exactly what this list is for. This is not something that you need right at the beginning, but probably items that you will acquire through time. Okay, so the first thing I have on this list are stitch markers. I recently got new ones and they're like in this thing. They're not organized right now, so it's fine. But essentially there are these little clips that come in plastic or metal. These are metal ones. Some of them you can open, some of them you can't open. I like getting the ones you can open because if I'm getting them I might as well be able to open them. I used to have only like 10 or 20, maybe 10, 15 because I did lose a few of them. Plastic ones, so that's why I got new ones. Now stitch markers you can also substitute with just tying a ring of yarn. That's worked just fine. If I'm traveling somewhere and I don't have my stitch markers, I've done that and that's also fine. Essentially you need them to mark where decreases or increases or the beginning of a round, or if something happens in your pattern, it usually tells you to place a stitch marker. And yeah, I have these metal ones which have really worked fine. They're pretty like inexpensive. They cost around like 5 to 10 euros I would say for probably 100 pieces. And yeah, they're nice to have, but if you really don't want to spend that money or don't feel like you need them, you can tie yarn around it. Maybe a different color yarn is what I usually do so I can visually see it, and that also works just fine. I think for knitting, because usually you're slipping the marker, you don't need something that can be open. Like for crocheting, usually you have to like take it out and put it back in, but for knitting you're slipping it, so you can use a paper clip. You can use, I don't know, I've seen people use like earrings as well. Like the hoop earrings you can use. You can get creative with this. Like I would love to hear other things people are using as stitch markers. But I think, yeah, once you're making a lot of sweaters, a lot of garments, blah, 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 then yeah, why not invest 5 euros, 10 euros in a set of stitch markers? Okay, then another thing that you don't really need, but it's really handy to have, is a tape measure. Now, usually at the beginning of a pattern, you need to measure your gauge, which essentially is how many stitches fit in a 10 centimeter, in a 10 centimeter space. You count the stitches in that. And yes, you can use a ruler, that's totally fine. But I think once you get to measuring your pieces and especially measuring yourself, a tape measure, like this is the one I have, just your really basic, I think literally any German or Austrian grandma will have this somewhere in their house. Like this is a staple to, I don't know why, but I've seen these and they get so old, like these last forever. But anyways, I bought my own, so I guess mine looks pretty new still. But my point is that when you're like, I don't know, if you're measuring like your arm circumference, it's hard to do that with a ruler. Now, what I did for a long time, and this also worked just fine, was I took a piece of yarn and just like laid it around, held where it like ended, and then laid it against a ruler. And that also worked fine. I usually did it like 2 or 3 times just to account for some error. But ever since I've gotten the tape measure, that's kind of what I use and what I go to. And yeah, I recommend you get one. If you don't want to get one, you can also manage, put it that way. I think also measuring your garments, again, you can use yarn, you can use a long ruler, but it's just nicer to have something like this. Again, this was, I think, 5 or 6 or 7 euros. They do come cheaper, but I just wanted to get like a good quality one. This is literally the one that lasts, like I've seen my grandma use this for like 50, 60 years, so I know this will last me a long time and not break. Okay, and then the next thing that is really good to have, but you also probably don't need, and I also literally only just bought one, and it has made things a lot easier, and that's why it's on this list and not on the don't need list, is a blocking mat. So I think if you're making something like a hat, if you're making scarves, probably if you're making socks or mittens, probably not something that you necessarily need. But if you are making garments, if you're making sweaters, tops, t-shirts, all those things, a blocking mat will make a big difference. Now, I just got one, and what I would do before, I would just lay it down in my bathroom floor. We did have floor heating in the winter, so it kind of worked pretty well. And I kind of put weights on it to keep it in place. But now with my blocking mat, I am putting my pins in, and it's really like, it's also just really satisfying putting the pins in and seeing your finished piece. But it's definitely something that I recommend, but it's not really necessary, depending on what you make, I'd say. So maybe if you're just starting out knitting, if you're just trying out your stitches, this is not something you need. But once you venture into a little bit more intricate items, then maybe it's something you'd like to invest in. The one I got off of Amazon, and it was around I think 22 or 25, something around there, euros. So a little bit more expensive, but it is quite large. It comes in this like box that you can store. So yeah, I definitely a worth it investment for me, and I've really enjoyed using it. So yeah. Now I'm gonna share my quite long list of things that you don't need, in my opinion. Now, I understand that some of these might be a little bit controversial, and I'll try to give my explanations, and again, these are just my opinions, so feel free to share yours in the comments. I'd love to see how you feel. Maybe we disagree, and I think that's also totally fine. Everyone does things differently, and yeah, I'd like to share how I do my things. So the first thing on my list of things that I don't think you need is a row counter. I already mentioned this in my crochet don't need, but I think in knitting it's a little bit of a different thing, because for knitting I think you just mostly measure your garments, and then you knit until it measures, I don't know, 20 centimeters. I don't feel like I've ever needed to count my rows. I don't know, and if I need to count my rows, I can just like go back and count how many I've done and then get the other side to the same amount. I downloaded a row counter once on my phone. I never used it. I kind of pressed it twice for 2 rows, and then 10 rows later I was like, oopsie. So yeah, I think they're like these, I'll try to put in a picture, they're like these little things that you just like press a little button every time you hit the end of a row, and then it counts the row for you. That's all it does. I don't think you need it. I think you'll be fine without it. The next one is a gauge square. Again, I'll insert a picture, and these are essentially these like measuring rulers that show you like in your 10 by 10 centimeter gauge. Like it lays out the 10 by 10 centimeter gauge, and then you can count the stitches in that square. I have a ruler and I can see how far 10 centimeters are, so I can count them there. I've never had an issue with it. Like I can even put in like a safety pin in the first one and then the last one, and then go across if I feel like it's moving around. I don't think you need a gauge measure. Like, I think it's one of those things that looks fancy, looks nice, but I think you'll be just fine without it. Then we have, and the next one I know is gonna be a controversial one, because everyone, especially here on YouTube, they have these beautiful project bags, and I just don't think you need one. I understand that if you're working on like various different projects, you want to separate them, you want to have the yarn and what you're making in a bag, but I really don't think it's necessary to spend money on the bag to hold that. I think, I don't know, I have like 20 bags lying around in my apartment, mostly like cloth bags or shopping bags or even like an IKEA Ziploc bag if it's a small project. I'm not gonna go out and spend like 20, 30, like some of them are so expensive, 40, 50 euros on a project bag that I kind of already have in different forms lying around my house. They are nice, and I do keep my projects in some sort of container. Sometimes it's a box, sometimes it's a bag. I just don't think you need a specific project bag to do that for you. I think, don't get me wrong, there's some project bag designers with beautiful project bags, and if that's something that makes you happy, then go for it. Like, I'm not trying to discourage that, but yeah, I use whatever is around my house, and I'm sure you could too if you're trying to decide what you do and you don't want to spend money on. Okay, the next one that I don't think you need are stitch holders. So I can show you mine because I did just buy them. So I guess that's a bit of a contradiction, but essentially I'll explain why. And they're these big, like, it kind of looks like a really big safety pin that you can open and close and you can rest your stitches on. I recently got these because I found that I was putting a lot of stitches on yarn all the time, and that is how you can kind of substitute them. So instead of this, you would just take a piece of yarn, maybe a thicker piece of yarn that you can like thread a needle through and then pull through your stitches, so they're still on rest and you can still put them on your knitting needle after or when you need to work on that part again. But essentially there are these things that come in like various different sizes that will do that for you as well. It is just one of those things that I think with time and as your projects maybe get a little bit more intricate, you can invest. They're really cheap as well, like 5 euros for a pack of, I don't know, 10, 15 of them. But I think if you're starting out and if you, yarn works just fine, and I worked with yarn for a really long time and it worked just fine. I think especially if you're trying on, yarn can actually kind of be nicer, especially if you're making like a garment and want to try on like the yoke at the top. If you put yarn, then you can move a little bit in it, but with these I guess you have to put like a lot of them. I haven't really done it because I still use yarn for that. But yeah, I think they can be useful, but I don't think it's something that you need right off the bat. Again, I got these off Amazon, I believe, for around 5 euros, so not gonna break the bank, but I don't think it's something you need. Okay, the next item I do not own, and I have never needed it or felt the need for it, and that is a yarn winder, I think it's called, or basically they're these big wooden things that like unfold and you put your yarn on and you like wind it from your already wound yarn. I'm not sure why why that's necessary. I don't know, like I'm not sure why I would need that. I think it looks very pleasing, and there are all these influencers that have like beautiful yarn walls, and that's really nice, and if it makes them happy, that's wonderful. But I think for me personally, like, I've never really felt the need for it, so I'm not going to spend money on it. I think if I buy yarn, I'll use it from the ball, and if I buy yarn that gets messy, then I'll just wind it up with my fingers, and that's worked totally fine. If I frog something, I wind it up with my fingers, like literally just like wrap it around my hand, my fingers, and make kind of like a yarn ball out of that. Worked fine. But I think a yarn winder is not something that I'll be getting anytime soon. If ever the point comes that I feel like I need one, I might get it, but up until now, 20 years into knitting, I have not needed one yet. Okay, then the next item that I do own, again, I inherited this from my grandmother, but I don't think you really need it, is this, it's like a specific or special ruler kind of. And essentially what it does, it obviously has your centimeters and your inches at the bottom, but the holes here like serve as a needle measure. So what you do is, I have a needle here, and imagine like, I mean, this one says it on it, but imagine I don't know what thickness needle this is. Then I kind of like poke it into the holes until it like just fits through. And the first one it fits through, that's like my needle size. So this one is a 2.5 millimeter needle. I mean, it says it on it, so I guess that's correct. But that's what this thing does. And I think if you're first starting out knitting and you're buying your needles, it says what the needle size is on the package, like that's what you're buying it for. I think this really saved me because I got this huge box of needles, half of it wasn't labeled, and like how am I ever gonna find out the size of a knitting needle if it's not written on it? Like I can guess, but between 2 3/4 and 2.5 millimeters, I have no idea. So for me, this was really useful, but I don't think it's something that you need if you're just starting knitting or if you're buying your stuff, buying your needles because you'll know what you're buying. I'd say if your needle doesn't come labeled and you want to kind of like remember what width it is, I recommend you use a Sharpie, use a permanent marker and just like label it with a color, maybe write on it or something like that. But yeah, for me this is useful, but I don't think it's something you need to get. It's just kind of a fun thing to measure my needle sizes. Okay, then the next thing I don't think you need is a needle holder or like a needle case. They're, I don't know, they come in like all different shapes and sizes, but they are like these beautiful pencil cases that you can like put your needles in, and it's nice, but I think you can, again, similar to like my project bag philosophy, I think you can use anything. Like I have these that like my grandpa like handmade these and they fit, I mean this one has my stitch markers or my stitch holders, but they fit most needles quite nice. I think with the cable needles it's kind of hard anyways to keep them anywhere, so I just keep them in like a larger box. But yeah, I don't think it's something you need to spend your money on. Again, I think with any of these, if it makes you happy then go for it, but I don't think it's necessary per se. Okay, then there are needle stoppers, which I also don't think you need. They're essentially these like, I guess they come in all like shapes and materials, but it's something you put on the back of your needle. So say if you're using sock needles, people put like something to stop the yarn, the stitches from sliding off. I've never really had an issue with stitches sliding off the sock needles because you're only really occupying like this thick or this width of stitches on your needle, and I don't know, I guess I'm a pretty tight knitter so it doesn't really come off. I think if that is something you do struggle with, I don't think you need to go out and buy needle stoppers. You can use blue tack, you can use, I don't know, clay if you have some lying around, or you can use like tape or something. There are many different alternatives. I've never had needle stoppers, I've never really needed them. But yeah, it's not really an issue with the cable needles anyways because they can't really go anywhere. And yeah, so I don't think it's something you need. Then we have a yarn bowl. They're beautiful yarn bowls all over the internet. They're beautiful handmade ones, pottery yarn bowls, all these beautiful things. Essentially it's a bowl where you put your ball of yarn, and then sometimes they even have like a little, like a carving where your yarn then comes out and then your yarn doesn't run away. And yeah, I don't know, I think they're nice. Don't get me wrong, I don't personally own one. I've seen people use like all sorts of paper knives, like things like Crocs for example, where the yarn comes out of the holes. Yeah, I don't know, I don't own them. I've not felt the need to own them, but I don't know, if I'm at a market and I see a nice yarn bowl and I want to support a local artist, I'll of course get one as well. But at the moment I don't have one, I don't need one, and maybe you don't really need one either. On the topic of yarn is a yarn guide for your fingers. I'll put in a picture, but it's like these things that you clip or you put on like kind of like as a ring to guide the yarn. And I understand that when you're first starting out to knit, it can be a little bit difficult for your fingers to adjust to the new movement. But I would say just practice, take your time, take lots of breaks, you know, do some hand movements if you need to relax those muscles. Maybe don't overdo it at the beginning and slowly get your hands used to the motion of knitting. Because I think, yeah, I don't think you need a yarn guide for your finger. Yeah, just use my finger. Even if I'm doing color work, I'll wrap like one yarn this way, the other one yarn that way, and that way I can always pick one or the other. But yeah, I think it's, I don't know, people use them, I guess. I don't think you need them. And I think also if you're learning to knit with a yarn guide on your finger, then you're kind of always destined to use that when you're knitting in the future, and I'm also not sure that's something that I would want, especially if I'm knitting on the go, or if it would mean if I lose it, I don't have it, that I couldn't really knit the way I usually do. So I think it's best to just slowly get adjusted to the movement and just use your fingers and get a feel for it that way. So the last thing that is on my list of things I don't think you need is a sock blocker. I talked about a blocking mat as something that's nice to have, but I also mentioned that maybe you don't need it for socks. But what they do make for socks is like these metal frames. I don't have it, so I can't show you, but like it's like a metal frame or wooden frame that you like put your finished sock on to like take on that shape. And I don't know, I've made a lot of socks in my life. I've actually kind of stopped making socks because I have so many homemade socks just in my drawer. But I've never felt like, oh, I wish that sock had been on a sock blocker before I wore it, kind of. I've never had that thought. So I don't think it's something you need. I mean, it's a sock, it's gonna go on your foot, and I think your foot kind of already acts as the sock blocker. I think the reason you block items is to kind of get the, either for lace or if you're doing like some sort of pattern, to get that evened out, or for it to take on a certain shape. So for if you're making a sweater, you're blocking it so it has a nice drape, so it looks even, and by pinning it into shape, you're hoping that the garment will take on the shape you're pinning it. Now for a sock, it's gonna go on my foot and the shape is my foot. I'm not making loose socks because I'll lose them, right? So I don't think you need to block a sock, other than, I don't know, laying it down wet if you're making a sock with lace or something like that. So yeah, I don't think sock blockers are necessary. If you have a blocking mat, I'm sure that would work just fine as well if you pin your sock in there, but I don't think you need to spend money or have your space occupied by sock blockers. I see people on YouTube like show the socks they make like on sock blockers, and I think that is probably the only reason that I would ever buy one, if I wanted to show a sock that I made because it just looks nice. But other than that, I don't think you need a sock blocker. Okay, so that is my list of things you really need, maybe don't need, and probably really don't need when you're knitting, maybe when you're beginning to knit, or when you're already far into your knitting. Again, this is my experience. I'd love to hear if you have different views and things. Maybe I missed something out, so leave those comments below as well. And yeah, I hope it kind of helped. Maybe if you're thinking about starting to knit but not really sure what you want to buy at the yarn store or what you should be buying. I think there's so much marketing, so much, I don't know, on Instagram, all the influencing that is being done, which, don't get me wrong, I think it's wonderful. I think it's so cool that like there is this big platform and like the social media all around knitting and creating and arts and crafts and so on. I think that's wonderful, but I think it is easy to kind of fall into a thing of, oh, I need all these things all these people have, but I really don't think you do. And hopefully I was able to give a little bit of insight about maybe how you can think about what you need and what you don't need, keeping the space that you have in mind, keeping your budget that you have in mind. So yeah, because I think a lot of things are nice to have, but you really don't need most of them. Yeah, so those are my 2 cents on knitting and the equipment, the items, the materials that you need. Thank you for watching, thank you for sticking around, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!